today calls herself an entrepreneur because she specializes in the local art and history of Michigan, Detroit, and the Great Lakes. She has given dozens of lectures on these topics over the last 5 years. She's been here before. You might remember her from past presentations. Great Female Artists of Detroit was one of my favorites. She is an author by a book of that same name, Great Female Artists of Detroit, which is published by the History Press. She holds a degree from Oakland University, and she's a native of Detroit. Her family originally settled in the city over 100 years ago. Please help me welcome Suzanne Villette.
Now, Stephanie also told me that there are a few people here who are actually from Corktown, or their families are from Corktown, something. Oh, quite a few, okay. Well, when we get down to the end, maybe you want to give us some comments, or if you want to make any comment in between, feel free, okay? Okay, so today we're going to talk about Corktown. It's the oldest neighborhood in Detroit, and it's one of the coolest neighborhoods in Detroit now too, because it has authentic urban grit. And in Corktown, that means historical appeal in the buildings and the people and the artwork that we're going to see. So this community has really changed over the last 184 years. And we all know that today the name of the game in Detroit is revitalization, right? And nowhere in Detroit is it being experienced more than here in Corktown. There's all kinds of new development that hasn't been seen in decades anywhere in the city. So how I decided to put this together for you today is we're going to talk about some of the history. Now, Corktown is also part of a larger area called Southwest Detroit, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And at the end, I'm going to bring it all back home to Corktown again, too, so you're going to get everything, the whole ball of wax. First of all, I want to tell you about where this historic district is. Here is downtown Detroit, and it starts at about 3rd Street. So 3rd Street, you can tell, that's really close to downtown. And that was because this is a working class neighborhood, so the people wanted to be close to where the jobs were. Up here, this used to be North Corktown before urban development came in and put in the freeways and sort of made it smaller. It also, this is the main building block, the residential section, but really Corktown and Southwest Detroit goes all the way over here to where the new Gordie Howe Bridge is going to be. I'm going to take you to the Ambassador Bridge a little bit. We're going to go down here all the way to Jefferson, and that also used to be Irish. Then it was French first, then Irish, Latino. So I'm going to take you all around there. First of all, in this picture, there are 3 things I want to show you. There's a lot of history. First, you have the train station in the background. And then, of course, you have the people here, and though many of them probably they're Irish, and so their ancestors came from Ireland, you know, and now they're still here in the area. And also, the Irish American Club, they're the ones who sponsor this parade. And I also want to tell you something else. Okay, so the Irish, they came here in the earlier to mid-1800s. They emigrated here by the millions to America and to Detroit. But they weren't the only group. There were also Germans who came at around the same time or a little bit after. And they also settled in some of this area too. But by the 1840s or 1850s, the Irish were about half of the population in this area of Southwest Detroit called Corktown. Okay, so back to the parade now. It's sponsored by the Irish Club, and they're the ones who organize the parade every year. Plus, when it ends up, it goes right here, and it has a restaurant inside. If you ever wanted to visit it, you can have lunch there, anything like that. The Irish Club, though, they said they were established to preserve and promote the Irish race. And they did a pretty good job because they've been established and been going for almost 100 years. So they'll have their 100th anniversary next year. I also want to show you something else about their club, about their building. You'll notice that it's a 2-story building, which is very common for many of these historic businesses that are on Michigan Avenue. And here are some more of the parade goers, but the real reason I'm showing you this too is for these structures. So these are on Michigan Avenue. You can see they're about the same, right? 2 stories, kind of long and narrow, and none of this has really been changed. So ever since the 1980s or so, many buildings in this area were boarded up, like many others in downtown Detroit. But this old architecture has stayed, and that's what makes this area so authentic. Keep going here now, and some of the houses. So the residential part of Corktown, though, is the most historic part of the area. The painting itself, that was done in 1929, which is about the time of those commercial buildings being erected. And many of these homes were working class homes for the working class people. And what's interesting is that many of them are still occupied. So they've lasted the test of time too. There are about 3,000 people living in Corktown right now. There are about 800 residences, meaning the homes that are still there and active. And most of these homes, though, they're kind of small. They're maybe 500 square feet, 1,000 square feet, like that. They're not too big. Another painting from around the same time, a little later. You can see the homes here in the window here of the auto worker. And back then, many Irish and other immigrants were coming to Detroit, and that meant that they wanted a new way of life, right? There were a lot of jobs here, but the only problem was there wasn't always a lot of housing. So it was kind of crowded back then, and sometimes they would cram like 8 to 10 people in one of these smaller homes. And I know I heard some stories from my grandma. She said that they had some renters there too, and the other stories I heard were that the workers, they often slept in shifts. So in other words, this might be a daytime worker, and then he would go, and then the man came home and he would sleep in the same bed at night because they had to have some place to live and to sleep. The watercolor painting is by Jack Steele, and he shows a working man, an auto worker who rented a room in the artist's boyhood home in Detroit. Okay, now these homes in Corktown, they were established, some of them are way back from the very, very early days. And as a matter of fact, Corktown itself was first established in 1834. And that's when Andrew Jackson was our president, just to give you some idea. So there are all different styles of homes here. There are federal style, Victorian townhouses, there's Queen Anne, and they were all built by these early settlers. And I also put in a picture here of how some of the people looked. This happens to be a big Detroit artist, but I won't get into him, but around the time of the Civil War. And this home in Corktown, it's on Bagley, is from that Civil War era. But it's still occupied. And how you can tell is it has a TV dish up on the top. And there's also a garbage can down here too. So people are still living in these homes. You know, the other thing, this is the oldest building, this tenement row house, they say is the oldest building in Detroit. And that was one of those very early structures. Now you notice that it's really close to the church though. And that's Holy Trinity Church. That was like the cornerstone of Corktown. That's when, and in the 1800s and later on when the urban development came into this area in the later mid-1950s or so, when all the freeways came in, this area was decimated. And also, that's when some of the jobs, the white flight, started to happen. So there were a lot of poorer people, these immigrants in this working class. And that's when some of the factories closed too, like in the 1980s, right before before we got all the right after we got all the competition from the foreign car companies. Like the Cadillac Fleetwood plant was located sort of like right in this area. So when that closed, many of these people were left without jobs. And they came to the church throughout this whole period, this 180 years, to get, some help, to get some refuge, and of course to pray. There was a man named Clement Kern. He was one of the fathers who devoted himself to assisting migrants who came to this area of southwest Detroit. Now, some of you also may remember the old radio announcer J.P. McCarthy, okay? Every St. Patty's Day, he would have a big party on the radio, right? All the politicians would show up, and all the money that he collected on that day was donated to Holy Trinity Church. So it was a very good place for people to come if they needed help. This workers' row house that's right next to the church, it's very simple, 2 stories, 3 units, and somehow this tiny building has managed to survive for 170 years. So that is real, authentic workers' grit, right? And since urban renewal in the 1960s wiped out a lot of the neighborhood, it's really even more amazing that it survived. Now, after a while, it was taken over by the church, but the church actually closed it, and it had been abandoned since the 1980s in there. So now, though, a nonprofit is turning it into a historical cultural site, and it's a community art center. They want to bring people in, they want to bring tourism in, and art and history are tools for economic development, especially in Detroit. So it's going to attract a lot of those tourists. There is a Corktown Historical Society, and the president said of that society, "This is a piece of history. Usually when you see examples of life in the 1800s, you have to go to Greenfield Village or someplace like that, right? And that's where we're going to go. I'm going to take you to Greenfield Village to show you the Grimm Watch Building. And this was originally located in Corktown on Michigan Avenue. So the store, it was acquired by Henry Ford in 1940 for Greenfield Village. And this is an artistic view of the building. It's been color enhanced by the artist, but you can see the owner's name is Grimm. That's up at the top. And this is it in Greenfield Village, and that's a woman in period costume at the village. But I also want to show you once again the architecture. 2 stories, kind of long and narrow, very typical of that era. Now, young Henry Ford, he came to the shop in Corktown. Oh, and I also want to say, the Grimms, too, they lived upstairs. So he had the business, he owned the building, but it was still, not a high-class type of living. That was regular, everyday living. And Henry Ford, he would come to this shop to purchase tools and get his watch repair, items, because he started out as a tinkerer and as a mechanic. And he became friends with Mr. Grimm. And then Engelbert Grimm, who was one of those German immigrants that I was telling you about that also lived in the area, after 45 years in business, he closed the store and he willed the contents of it to his good friend Henry Ford. And that's when it moved to Greenfield Village. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some other little different architecture. We're going to move a little further into around the early 1900s. We're at the farther side of Corktown now, a little bigger architecture. And I put this photograph in it because it's very colorful, and you almost never see churches done in this kind of treatment. It almost looks like a lighthouse or something like that. So I thought it was really beautiful. This is Holy Redeemer. It's also an anchor of this southwest Detroit neighborhood, but it's on the far western side of it. And it still has a high school operating inside of it, but it's not owned by the church or anything like that. But there are a lot of commercial buildings around this church. So it's a very vibrant and active area. And at one time, this was the largest Catholic parish in the United States. So inside, it holds 1,400 people. And in 1960, they instituted a Mass in Spanish here because the neighborhood was once again changing because of immigration, and now Latinos live a lot in this area. This is, Mexican village sort of area too. That's all part of it. It's a very beautiful church. This is an enlargement of the mosaic that is here above the door. And I had to look that one up for you. The tower, it's called a campanile. And that's the bell tower. It was added in memory of parishioners who died in World War I. And this church was actually refurbished in 1923 too, so they keep it going. Now inside it, you find angels at a side altar, and there's paintings and delicate carved sculpture all inside of it. There are windows inside of it that were created by the Detroit stained glass work. And they also have Pewabic mosaic floor tile in the church by Mary Chase Perry Stratton, also a Detroiter. So what I'm trying to get across here is that these huge religious institutions were using Detroit artists because they were considered some of the best in the country. Okay, so far you saw some commercial properties around Michigan Avenue. I showed you a few of the houses in the residential section of Corktown. Right about here is where Holy Trinity is. Over on this side is where Holy Redeemer is. I'm going to take you down to St. Anne. You see Mexican Village here. And the train station. So we're going to take you to a lot more too. You know, about 1970 though is when this poster was produced. And that was a good thing that those years, because this is also around the time when this Corktown area was designated as a historic area. And what that did was allow that these buildings, even though they weren't occupied, they weren't allowed to be torn down. So that's why we have a lot of this really beautiful architecture to look back to. Okay, right in the same area up there in the corner is Tiger Stadium, and that's our next stop. So if you've been down Michigan Avenue lately, you'll notice that they still have the brick on the street. I never quite understood why they never paved that over, but they didn't. This is the old stadium when it used to be called Briggs Stadium. The painting is by longtime Detroit artist Paul Adams, and he used to be an illustrator for the car companies, but he's showing you the Detroit of his youth. So in the early 1950s, they still had the streetcars running. I think those stopped around 1956. You can see the old cab companies, cars here, these others, and you see the people going in. The women, they're all dressed in dresses to go to the ball game, right? So things have changed since then. This is a little more current view of the building. It was done about 10 years ago when the building was torn down. It's from the same vantage point as the other one I showed you, so you can see it's changed a little bit. When they demolished it though, it left this 10-acre site on this corner open for redevelopment. And that's when the Detroit Police Athletic League opened a sports facility on this site. And they put in AstroTurf. And also it's a field for all kinds of students to come and play here now. So it's, you know, for the people in the area. There are two new developments on this corner though. Okay, so here it is how it looks in last year. So they tore down the stadium, they put in the new AstroTurf, and all this corner, you can see there's nothing on it, but if you would go there today, this is almost all enclosed. What they're doing is putting in a new $37 million mixed-use development called The Corner. It now surrounds the ball field. It's almost near completion. They're going to have apartments there, and they're modular apartments, you know, modular houses, so now they're making modular apartments too. And they are renting studio apartments and larger ones. The rents are anywhere from $900 to about $2,000. They're going to have retail and commercial space down here. And another section that they're putting in near the back end of the stadium there are townhomes. And they're going to start at $399,000. So Detroit is really coming back, right? We haven't seen those kind of prices in a long time. And this Corktown, this is a really emerging neighborhood. And when you get to emerging neighborhoods, you usually have artists. They're the first ones who come in and sort of, you know, start getting houses and use the area. So that's what I'm going to do. So I've kind of told you about the old. Now we're going to go to the new, and I'm going to take you to Corktown Studios. Very near the stadium is this building, and they call it an artist collective. So you already know that means it's a hip and cool place, right? Just by the name. And they say their mission is to provide affordable studios for their members and community exhibit space. And they talk a lot about re-emerging and becoming a hub for the community and reviving the creative spirit. So this artist collective has, I believe it was 4 owners, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of them. Paula Zamet, she's a local painter. She's the one who did this piece. And she says she is happy to be immersed in the rebuilding of their North Corktown neighborhood. So her work is known for its very sensual characteristics. And if you look really close up here at the top of her painting, she just barely shows you the woman's lips, you know, so she's just giving you a little hint about what's to come. And I love the name of it, Iron and Cotton, which I thought really described Detroit well, right? All about the grit and the authenticity that we have here. There's another gentleman who's part of the collective. His name is Jake Chichester. He's an architectural designer and artist. He's adjunct faculty at Lawrence Tech University. And this one is the one I really like. Her name is Allison Malik. And she says she's an artist and a globe traveler. That sounds good, right? Yeah. And then she kind of plays her other day job down, she says. I am the chief operating officer for a driverless vehicle startup company. Okay, but this is very convenient because almost across the street from the Tiger Stadium is the new Ford Technology Center. And a team of more than 200 Ford workers are developing driverless and electric vehicles in this old hosiery factory right across from the stadium. So you'll notice the style of the building, very much like the jeweler. You know, this one happens to be 3 stories tall though, and it's kind of long and narrow too. It's 3 stories, 45,000 square feet, and Ford kept the wood beam ceilings and the hardwood floors, but you'll notice that there are no offices with walls. So this is open office space. And there are no desks, and there are no papers, and there are no filing cabinets. So all the workers need today is your laptop and your computer skills, your brain skills. So it's a new and conducive operation for sharing and a very collaborative way of working. So Ford is retooling vehicles to enhance life in urban areas, and they're trying to become part of the urban experience. And you know, you probably heard a lot of young people today, and older people like me, you know, everybody wants to move back downtown. Everybody wants to go back into the urban areas because that's where it's all happening. So that's why they put their new business and strategy teams in Corktown, because this is the up and coming place. And if you're in this area, you might see them working on these driverless cars. They have that big plastic white thing up on the top. They're driving around. And Ford, though, they made an even bigger investment in this area last year. In 2018, exactly 30 years after the Michigan Central train station was closed, the lights were turned on again. And that happened in May of 2018, and that was the night that the Ford board had decided to purchase the building. And they purchased it from Matty Maroon for $90 million. And the rehab costs are going to be $700 million. But don't worry, we're going to help them pay for that, so you don't have to worry about Ford. So the reason Ford bought the building is they want to make a fresh start. And they want to compete in all this new technology, these new self-driving vehicles. And they also want to be a part of Detroit's reinvention. So they're going urban. And by going urban, they also think that they'll be able to attract a lot more younger workers, right? Who'll want to come to this kind of place. So since last year too, since they announced, many new businesses have moved in. All these old warehouses and factories that have been boarded up are now getting new life. And this train station, it closed in 1988. And when it did, it became very dilapidated, just like the rest of the neighborhood. But Ford, they like the symbolism. And the Ford family, they want to tell you they're still players, not only in the car companies, but also in Detroit. And here we have Bill Ford Jr., the current chairman of the board. He's following in his great-grandfather's footsteps. So in other words, Ford is coming all full circle back around. His great-grandfather, Henry Ford, started out in this area in Corktown. And the Ford family, they actually have their roots in Ireland in County Cork. So you can see how it all works together, and that's obviously how the neighborhood derived its name. So Ford, they're going to make this area a new technology campus with over 2,000 workers here, new parking structures, a lot more housing, just like the old days. So most of all, with all these businesses move in, that's going to help the tax base of Detroit too, and it's going to help be vibrant again. So once again, the neighborhood will be working class. Everybody's going to be able to walk to work like they used to. And they've already started on the restoration, and artists, they love hanging around this area too. Okay, now the train station, Michigan Central train station, it closed in 1988. And the building, you all know, became very dilapidated, just like the rest of the neighborhood. And the reason it was abandoned was that after World War II, the modes of transportation really changed. Nobody wanted to travel by train anymore. You wanted to take your car. You wanted to get in your car and see the open road. And then in the 1950s and the 60s, that was the peak of the auto industry before the foreign competition came in. And that is when Matty Maroon purchased the train station, and also he purchased the Ambassador Bridge. That was in 1979. So Michigan Central was in operation for 75 years. It was built by the same architects that designed Grand Central Station in New York. And even in this old print, you know, it doesn't look like a very becoming building, right? I mean, it's not really too nice. So often we would see pictures of the train station in the news media. It was all broken out with all the windows. It was a symbol of American urban blight, right? And so if people would just go around to the back of the train station, though, here's the train station, and this is the rear of it, to Bagley and St. Anne, they would see this beautiful mural, as well as several others that are right in this intersection here in another neighborhood, which is now more Latino. The name of this mural is called The Cornfield, and it depicts the Mexican roots of a local Latino artist. He lives right down the street. His name is Vito Valdez, and he actually worked at the Fleetwood plant when it closed. So then he had to start doing something else. He had art skills. He's developed them, and now he's even a teacher of students at the DIA. So art can really help you move forward. And I'm going to continue down St. Anne Street to the Detroit River, and that's where we find historic St. Anne Church. So from the later 1800s to about World War II, this was a French neighborhood. And before, you know, around the same time, the Irish were here and the French, and then the French moved out and the Latinos sort of moved in more. And it's good that the Latinos are here because they're also, many of them are Catholic. And they're supporting these old churches and keeping them alive, which is a great thing because they have so much history and artwork in them. These stained glass windows in this church are some of the oldest in the city. And if you turn in the back of the parking lot behind the church, this is the view that you would see. It's a beautiful close-up view of the Ambassador Bridge. So now I'm just going to tell you a little about the bridges because that's a big part of this Corktown neighborhood too. The Ambassador, like I said, it's also owned by Matty Maroon. And it's featured in another contemporary painting from the Corktown artist, Paula Zammit. She's the one I showed you a little earlier. And you notice the feather in the woman's hat. It sort of also makes the clouds over the bridge. It's really pretty there, so she's a great artist. So since Maroon owns this bridge, though, he's fought against the idea of a new bridge for years. He had a lot of lawsuits and all that, and he really wanted to prevent the new Gordie Howe Bridge from moving forward. So I think I did read this, that the train station, how it was just purchased, that was all sort of part of a land swap, and there were a lot of other things going on there. But guess what? Maroon said that he thought a twin span would be a better way to take care of the bridge problem. You know, we're all experiencing the bridges having to be redone, the structure. And he wanted a new twin span to be built. So this is an artist's rendering of what it would look like. Here's the old bridge, and here's the new bridge. So, like that. And guess what? He's going to get his new span too. So we're going to have two new bridges. His company got all the permits to proceed, and I think it had something to do with that land swap. And this bridge, though, is all privately funded. It's going to cost about $1 billion. And he was very forward-thinking. He already spent about half the money to have it built, so it is moving forward. Almost 1/4 of all the goods traded between Canada and the United States move over this bridge, and over 14,000 vehicles a day cross this toll bridge owned by Mattie Maroon. Now, many years ago, a Canadian artist documented the construction of the Ambassador Bridge from the Windsor perspective. So here's Detroit here in the background, here's Windsor, and there's the bridge. Now, the construction of the Ambassador Bridge, it took only 2 years, and it only cost about $24 million. Sounds pretty low, right? It opened in the late 1920s, right before the Great Depression. And then Mr. Maroon, he bought it 50 years later. And it definitely needs updating because it's almost 90 years old. And Mattie Maroon is almost the same age too. He's 90 years old. So this is a lovely drawing. It has very beautiful colors. It's a pastel. It's by Canadian artist Charles Simpson, who also did work on our side of the river a lot too. Okay, so we are at the Ambassador Bridge, and we're looking, here's the Ambassador Bridge, and we're looking downriver. We're looking towards Lake Erie. And about 2 miles down, that's where they're going to put the new Gordie Howe Bridge. So also what I want to say is there's going to be a lot of construction going on in this area in the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of new jobs. So you're going to see a lot more people moving into the area too. This new bridge crossing in Detroit will be named after Gordie Howe. He's the great Canadian athlete who played for the Detroit Red Wings. And he's considered the greatest hockey player of all time. So he was right here in Detroit. The original cost estimate of the new bridge was $2.2 billion, and it was supposed to open in 2020. But we know they're not going to make this. The revised estimate is $4.4 billion, and it's going to open in 2024. And it's estimated, though, that the bridge will generate over $70 million in toll revenues in just its first year of operation, though. So hopefully it'll pay itself off. So Mattie Maroon didn't want it, but it was backed by the American and the Canadian government. As a matter of fact, the Canadian government is picking up a lot of that price. And here you see another conceptual drawing of the bridge. And over here you see the cement plant, and here's the bridge going over, and you see some of Corktown over there, like that. So next we have a quick tour of this new international bridge site. Here again is the cement plant. And this right over here is Zug Island. So the bridge is going to come right in through here. And a huge Zug Island, if you're not familiar with it, it's a huge industrial site where the steel factories and the auto plants were located. Here's an up-close view of how the area looks today with the downtown in the background. So here's Zug Island. You know, they need to clean that up a lot, which I'm sure they're planning on doing. But don't worry, the future is bright, and the area looks all cleaned up in this artist view. There are 15 lanes here that we can get across and go over the bridge to Canada. And this is how it's going to look when it's finished. So it should be stunning when it's complete. Okay, so I took you through some history. I took you through some of the new stuff that's going on in Corktown in southwest Detroit. And now I want you to follow me because we're going to keep heading back to Corktown. And I'm going to review why we call this area Corktown. So why would these Irish people leave their homeland with the beautiful green rolling hills of Ireland and come to America? You know, many, pardon me? Starving, right. And many of them were peasants. They were working class poor. They were working in the fields. They were looking for a better life. And that meant there were jobs to be had in America. In the very early 1800s, many of these Irish people were working on the Erie Canal in New York. And when they finished the Erie Canal, what that did was bring a lot of Easterners to the Great Lakes. And their first stopping off point was always in Detroit, right? That was the big place they came to. So then they had even more jobs in the later 1800s. And you're right, the main food of these poor peasants, workers, was the potato. And then in the 1840s, there was a great famine in Ireland. It was caused by a disease that destroyed the potato crops. And that was one of their main foods. So as a number of the Irish immigrants came, they began to move into Corktown. They were coming to where their own people were. And I found this view of what it was like. So here is a woman, she represents Ireland, and she's holding a sign that says the population of Ireland. They started out in 1840 with over 8 million people. Not very long after that, a decade or two, they only had 3 million people. So 5 million people came mostly to America. And not all of them to Detroit, of course, but you know, to America. And if you look behind her, there's a stone, and that is the Irish cross. And back here are the two elderly people, and they're crying, and they're, you know, lamenting that their relatives, the younger ones, are all getting on a ship, and they're coming to America, just like a lot of other immigrants. And when they did, they had a very difficult time in the crossing. Most of them came, you know, on the Atlantic Ocean to America. And sometimes the trip was dangerous and stormy. Now this painting, it may not be famous, but it is a masterpiece. And it resides at the DIA. And the artist's name is Duncanson, Robert Duncanson. And he was from the Detroit area. And although he sounds Irish, he was of African American descent. And he lived in Detroit in the mid-1800s, so he was documenting some of the things that he was seeing. And he's considered one of, I think he's like the second most earliest African American artist in the United States, and he was right here from our area. So I'll tell you more about him some other day. I've got to keep moving. But he also did another painting. It's called The Drunkard's Plight. And it shows a disheveled man. He's coming home after a night of drinking. There's a lot of problems going on here, broken glass. He's facing his wife and son. There's a neighbor here who's, you know, giving her pointing her finger at him. And this could be Detroit. I don't know. There's a river back there. But I'm showing it to you because it kind of tells some of the stereotypes that the Irish experienced when they were coming here. And here's another sign, Irish immigration to America. And so they make the people look kind of funny, and he's sitting on top of a cask of liquor. So, you know, there's something going on there. They're trying to say that these people aren't quite up to par. Now, once the Irish, when they got to Detroit, they had to start building homes and apartments. And since the Irish were mostly Catholic, once again, they settled around the Catholic Church. Here's Holy Trinity again in the area. And I took this photograph myself, not more than 2 years ago. And you can see how the building looks. It still has never been painted. This one right next to it from the same era, it's still boarded up. And I also showed you the Irish lass. She's coming to the area from Ireland, and she's clutching her rosary. So she wants to be close, and most of them were Catholics here. Here's another photograph of it. I just took this one about a month ago, and you can see just like the rest of the area, it's completely updated. It's the same building, it's ready to be useful again, it's ready to be used. Now the tenement house is right behind the church. And now I want to show you just a few other examples that are still, of these homes that are still occupied. And by the way, this is the second church, in the second largest church, or the second oldest church in Detroit. Okay, so here's this beautiful house right here. You can see it's been well taken care of. It looks like something out of a Mark Twain novel, right? With the white picket fence in front of it, all painted beautifully right next to the church, has a good location. And in the 1980s, you could purchase one of these homes for maybe $30,000 or $40,000. Now the value is moving into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's because of the location, right? And it's a hip neighborhood. It's adjacent to all kinds of new businesses like that, and restaurants. And on the next block behind the church there is the John Mason residence. This is the home of a brewer. He actually had the business in the back of his home, and it was done in the Federal style, 1852. Now, it was built about 10 years before the Civil War, so that means about 10 years before Abraham Lincoln was our president. And he produced beer in the back. It was restored in 1992 by an architect, and it also is still occupied today. Okay, now breweries, and we talked a little bit about the reputation of the Irish. So if you go a few blocks down, in 2013, two men purchased the site of this old brick building. This used to be a taxi cab company, and it's located right next to the old train station. So that was a good location back then, right? If you got off the train, you needed a cab. But then it closed, just like the train station did, and these two young men turned it into a distillery that has become very popular. As a matter of fact, it's the first licensed distillery in Detroit since Prohibition. And for a bar and distillery, you can't get any better than being given a review that calls it booze heaven, right? So the logo, you notice, includes their names, and it just doesn't say Detroit. It says Corktown, Detroit, so that makes it extra special. And these two men, they were at the right place at the right time with the right product, so you might want to give them a try. And there are many other bars and restaurants, especially right in the same area, almost across from the train station, a little bit down, Slow's Barbecue. And then this one right here is called Sugar. And Sugar got a reputation because it was written up in Esquire magazine as one of the top 10 cocktail bars in the United States, okay? And I'm also showing you what else is new here is a statue, and that is right on the side of Slow's Barbecue. It's up at the top are two globes. At the top, you can't really see them very well, but they're going to be illuminated by solar power, and the piece symbolizes hope and nature, and it's going to be a beacon to the neighborhood, and they're showing the gratitude of their service for the veterans. Okay, so we went all around. I gave you the history, and that is the end of our program. It's a fresh start for Corktown. Thank you.